Back to Curb Your Ethics, Season 2, Episode 1. We'll be debating ethics. I'd now like to introduce our guests. First up, Michael Pentima.
I was told I would be getting $50 for this. I'll expect my check at the end.
Next up, we have Simon Mandel.
Hi, how's it going?
After that, we have Peter Demkowicz.
Hey, glad to be here.
Next up, Divya Unnam.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And last but not least, Neev Vora.
Hey everyone, good to be back.
The first question we'll be talking about today: does social media have the right to censor media that uses its platform? Anybody is welcome to jump in.
So I guess I'll start off here. So social media technically owns their platform. So essentially they are allowed to put out whatever they want. However, in recent years, social media has been increasingly used by for official purposes, by political figures, by governments. So there are certain messages that they want put out on private platforms, essentially. However, some of these things may be considered misinformation by social media, so they can kick it off the platform. So,
I think.
Go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say, I think the thing that we need to do here is decide whether we're going to continue to treat social media platforms as publishers or as actual platforms, because there is an actual distinction between the two. Publishers have the right to censor the material that gets put out. So the New York Times gets to choose what goes into the New York Times because they are a publisher. They're allowed to discriminate in that standpoint. But if you're a platform, you're not allowed to discriminate. So think Google search results. Google needs to catalog everything. They can't say, I don't like this website, so we're not going to include it in the search results. So social media platforms have been skirting that line a lot recently. They've been trying to keep the platform aspect so that they get treated differently by government censors and get regulated differently. But on the other hand, they're acting as publishers. So I think we need to decide between the two. And once we decide, they need to commit to that. They can't skirt that line anymore. That's the real problem.
So go ahead, Neev.
Okay, so I would say that if social media companies are liable for their content, then they should have every right to censor posts on their platform or on their published service, whatever you want to call it, because social media companies are a business. They're not charities, right? They are asking, their business model involves people and users posting content to get views, to get advertisements, but at the same time, it's very important to remember that social media companies, if they are liable and if they have to suffer the consequences of malicious posts, of misinformation, then they should have that right, just that they can kind of decide their own fate and use their own business practices to do that and operate as the business that they are.
And that's part of that distinction. So publishers are liable for what gets published. They also get the right to determine what they publish. So if the New York Times publishes something, the New York Times can be charged with libel, for example, if it meets the criteria, because they have that editorial choice. If you're a platform, you can't be charged with that, but you also give up editorial control. Social media platforms have been saying, we're not liable for our users' posts, but by the way, we're going to moderate posts. You can't grab bag those options. You need to take one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So during the recent election news and during coronavirus outbreak, there was a whole bunch of censoring by Twitter and Facebook. Twitter in particularly, they let some campaign tweets get deleted and others not be deleted. I'm pretty sure Bloomberg said some fake things about Sanders, and some were deleted, some weren't. and some of it may be considered as satire. So there's definitely a political element there. And then during the coronavirus outbreak, Facebook in particular were deleting they were deleting tweets by the Brazilian president Bolsonaro, who basically said that we shouldn't care about coronavirus, which kind of skirts into that point where like they're a private company and they might be liable if people take that information from the president and hurt themselves.
Divya or Peter, do either of you guys want to jump in?
I think it's an interesting thing when you have the platform that Google did take a transition recently with when you do a Google search, not everything will show up anymore. Particularly for like more of like copyright infringement, stuff like that, which I think is because we see that as a common good aspect. So I think that even if it was a platform, I think if the laws were to regulate it and say that this isn't something that we want to see, for example, like fake news or something like that, that then in that scenario, we could pass regulatory things in order to subsidize that problem.
I was thinking of this, like, I feel like it would depend on the platform and like the intention behind it. For things like Facebook and Twitter, where like a lot of people use it for, I guess, more personal things and like for interacting with political things, it really depends on how accurate the information they receive is and like what people will use for that information. For like some other platforms, well, the thing that comes into my mind is like with how I know Tumblr at the end of December like 2018 was actually censoring a lot of their own content, so like how that affects like creators. So a lot of creators like use social media as their own creative outlet, and suddenly like having like policies changing how like they interact with it affected a lot of their creative activity. So I feel like social media companies should like focus a little bit on how they interact with their user base.
Okay, so kind of moving along in the same vein then, I know we already touched on this a little bit, but should social media companies be liable for the content on their platforms? I know Mike already mentioned it, but perhaps the rest of you guys want to state what your opinion is too.
Yeah. So Divya brought up a good point about the Tumblr thing. They mainly censored things that could put them to liability, like pornography. So because they're because of the rules regarding pornography in many different countries, like it's hard to censor specific ones. So basically they put a blanket ban over it. That's at least my understanding of the issue. And that really curtailed a lot of people's way of living. So overnight, basically, people's way of getting income were basically snapped away by Tumblr. And I mean, Tumblr was kind of acting as a platform, but it was clear in the Tumblr terms and conditions, like they could basically take down whatever they want for any reason at any time. So it's definitely a touchy subject there, but I think it's within reason that they could basically control what's on their platform. And I think it's ethical for them. It's definitely ethical for them to be liable for like pornography laws or anything like that, because they basically control what's on their platform. They could take off what they want whenever they want. So they should be liable for it, yes.
So I think when we talk about making a company liable for what's on their platform, it's important to also understand the actual operations involved with reducing risky content, right? So whenever someone makes a post, there will be algorithms that will look through those, similar to how in Wikipedia we have algorithms and bots that would check for plagiarism or copyright infringements or vandalism in terms of bad language, anything like that. But these bots do not have, and these algorithms will not have 100% positive rate, there will be errors, and you cannot expect a company. I think you cannot realistically expect a company to catch every single instance of wrongdoing on their website. I think there should be transparency as to how these social media companies deal with certain content that can be controversial or that can go against their mission. But when you make it liable, it's very difficult for any company to reasonably follow that with 100% accuracy.
Well, I think the platform acts as a way to fulfill a social need of communication. And I think keeping it as an open platform allows for that social need to be more fulfilled, allows us more interaction to occur. And then that's why it can be act as a business to collect data, is because it fulfills such a need for society. So on that note, I think it's hard to be so regulatorial with it and have the company be liable, as you're going to take away something that we as society see is a need.
I think the distinction that you need to make is, are they being held liable for something in a legal sense or in a societal sense? So for example, going back to say the libel example, if something is published that's libelous, is it being published by published and promoted by an actual organization, or is it being promoted in a manner similar to the guy who gets up on a soapbox in the town square and just starts yelling? Because the guy in the town square who just starts yelling is not a concern, but if it gets picked up by multiple organizations and sent around as an official communication, then that becomes an issue. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into account as well, because a lot of these platforms have just become a bunch of people with soapboxes, stacking them and yelling as loud as they can. So, you know, are you concerned about the one guy in the in the town square just yelling his head off that the end of the world is coming? Typically, I would say no. Most people should be able to rationalize that. But, where the difference comes into contact is how widespread is that message being promoted? And is that causing any issues?
Then, Mike, if an organization is promoting it on a social media website, do you think the organization should be liable for that content, or should the social media platform be liable?
If the social media platform is acting as a platform, they shouldn't be liable. It should be the secondary promoter. So say you promote something that's just completely wrong. Say, to use a coronavirus example, you can't get coronavirus if you're left-handed, for an example, to just make something up. And the Washington Post or the New York Times comes by and starts spreading that around as if that was fact. Then those publications should be held liable for promoting that without doing any fact checking on it. But if it's an individual, say, Alyssa Milano picks up, your tweet and retweets it, then I don't think you can really publish the individual, because that would go against their free speech rights.
I definitely think there's a distinction between the individual and the organization. I think the organization does have the right to publishers. Like, if they're a big company, you have the ability to fact check it. That's part of your, your daily tasks.
And I think Twitter recently did something about that. I think Laura Ingraham, who's a television host. Let me bring that up here. Twitter deleted Fox News host's Twitter misleading post about a coronavirus cure. So
here's my question: do they have the tweet archived? Did she post it from her personal, or did she post it from, say, her show's account?
She posted it on her personal account.
See, that's where it gets a little gray for me, because I would think she's acting in her capacity as a private citizen, but on the other hand, she does still need to take into account that she is seen by some as an authoritative voice.
Yes.
But whether or not the platform itself is liable for that, I don't think they are.
I don't
I
think
think
they are.
Laura Ingraham posting something, stupid is not Twitter's fault.
It's definitely not Twitter's fault, but there is a chance that they might be legally liable for it, and that's why I think they have a right to remove it. Because basically, if you have a lawsuit where someone was hurt by like she was touting hydrochlorine, however you pronounce it.
Hydroxychloroquine.
There you go. She was promoting that as like a miracle cure, quite literally. And like if someone gets hurt and then brings that up in like their suit, and Twitter is might be in the crosshairs. Like if they cast a wide net in their like legal suit, Twitter could be in trouble there. And also like ethically, there was an argument yesterday. I was watching the news and someone said that, social media is run by engineers. So they try and engineer solutions to like ethical problems basically. And they're basically so because this tweet was misleading and because a lot of people can take that as the truth, they have like an ethical duty to kind of cut that off the platform, because people will die. Well, there's a chance that people may die by leaving it up.
And we've seen this come to fruition in Instagram adding fact checking on a lot of its pictures, and obviously Twitter starting to delete its tweets. So we're going to kind of transition out of the liability section now. Okay, in this next part, we're going to talk a little bit about the food industry. So in the food industry, employees in both delivery companies and common sit-down restaurants rely on their tips as their main source of income, but often don't receive any benefits. Is this ethical?
So I think with the current price structure we have, if you work in an industry that doesn't have tips, let's say like fast food, which is another minimum wage job, you're gonna be pretty much cut off at 39 hours every week just to avoid getting benefits. So I think something that tips does is allows people to not get benefits, make a little bit more money, and work more than 40 hours or 40 hours a week, which is something that's beneficial. But I do think in certain industries, such as Uber Eats or driving industries, I think the tip platform as a whole doesn't really work well. As if you're in certain areas, let's say you're by a college town, you're not going to get as much tips as if you would elsewhere. And I could imagine you have the right to choose not to accept those drivers, but your ratings might go down as a result of that. And you might, consequently lose more money as well just from doing that.
Does anybody else have another comment on the question?
I do understand where Peter's coming from in terms of like fast food versus sit down. So like if you're working at the counter at McDonald's, I definitely think you should be paid minimum wage. If you're, working tables at a sit down restaurant, I think the current tipped wage is around $5 an hour or so.
Yeah.
If I believe so, I could see that going up to 6. I don't think it should be the exact minimum wage, because a lot of the time when you factor in the tip wage, you like triple the money you're making. I believe the average is about $15 an hour with tips. So there is something that is being included in that. And I would rather tip than not tip at a restaurant, obviously. I'm not gonna just, leave the guy with no tip. But there's also an accounting in that fact that the minimum wage should be set for positions based not on tips, because the majority of minimum wage jobs won't be getting tips. and the rest, I would say the restaurant wage should be raised, but I don't think it should be the same level because if you get a $1 tip in an hour, say, and your wage is 6.25 as a restaurant worker versus 7.25 as the national minimum wage, $1 an hour in tips is attainable, I would think fairly easily. So you're gonna make up that difference. I've never worked in a restaurant job, so I don't know what the actual breakdown is, but I would think, if you have a party, especially because larger parties, gratuity is added on automatically at 15 or 20%. So say you have a party of 6, you spend $120 on a meal with a 15% gratuity, you definitely made a $1 an hour tip there, easily over averaging out.
I think a lot of the discussion comes from the whole benefit sides of it. When you work on tips, you don't get benefits at all, at least to my common knowledge.
You also
Uh,
don't get benefits on any minimum wage job that's, below 40 hours.
Yes,
So
yes, but I do think that's a combination of why though. Is I don't I tips generally seems as a way just to make sure that you can get around not having minimum wage because they're not full-time workers or part-time workers. And the whole thing is that pretty much they come and go. And you can also maintain your workers being off the books a lot easier when they work on tips.
the liquidity, or not, maybe liquidity is not the right word, but it's the one I'm going to stick with because I can't think of a better one right now. The liquidity within minimum wage jobs of people moving in and out of different positions is far higher than it is in other positions. Because if you look around, there are always jobs available
Yeah.
at, say, large fast food chains. It's really easy to move between those positions, more so than it is if you're working, say, at like Goldman Sachs and you're trying to move to a different company.
You're,
It's a lot easier to move between positions.
well, I think, but you also suffer that you're never going to get really out of minimum wage. Um, you're not going to move up the ladder. When I switch from Goldman to JP, there's a chance that I could apply for a job that makes a little bit more money. But when I apply for McDonald's to Wendy's, I'm still going to be making the exact same amount of money I made at McDonald's. It's very rare for you to apply somewhere else and get a job that's higher up on the chain. You pretty much always have to work up the chain in any minimum wage job. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting paid more. It might just mean, oh, you have a fancy new title. Um,
That's true, but there's a sense of protection in that as well. So if the economy tanks, like the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of bankers were out of work and it was really hard for them to find jobs in their fields. But in these jobs, the high velocity moving between jobs makes it easier if you get laid off from one to try to find a job somewhere else than if, Bear Stearns went belly up
yeah.
and everybody else is hurting and now, it's hard for you to find a job.
Absolutely. I just think it's harder to actually maintain any sense of like savings or actual like economic responsibilities. You're not really when you work at one of these jobs, tips or not, you're not really maintaining the savings. If you get sick, you're not going to the doctor because you don't have those benefits that exist. So that would have to be from your savings, which means you're probably taking out a loan, which probably means you're paying from paycheck to paycheck. Which hypothetically, if you're working in tips industry, hey, maybe people take pity on you. If you come every day, you kind of know a little bit about their life. So maybe you'll pay a little bit more, which tips could help out there. We still come down to the overlying themes of minimum wage workers don't really get benefits. And, that's a cost of the employer, absolutely. But isn't that something that as a society we would like to see as an acceptable cost? I would beg to offer.
The problem with that is you have a lot of small businesses, the local pizzerias who still have to can only hire those people part-time because once they go over 40 hours a week, then that guy has to provide healthcare coverage for those workers, and the local guy probably isn't gonna be able to sustain that.
So I have a funny idea. that may be able to remedy that solution by giving everyone health
when you
care,
figure out how to
not
pay
based
down,
on employers.
when you figure out how to pay down the $24-ish trillion in debt that we have right now, then I'll be willing to entertain that idea.
I mean, okay. Regular health insurance not given by employers costs around $20,000 a year for a family. However, if a universal health care plan was instituted on Sanders' website, at least it said it was $867 a year in taxes. So I believe that's a much better plan by giving everyone health care, cutting out the middleman basically, and reaping the benefits.
Here's the difficulty with that, as you've just described it. So $20,000 for individuals.
Yes.
I'm gonna round it. $850 for government.
Sure.
Unless you're taxing for that 20,000, you're not gonna pay off anything. So my concern is the debt load, because we're reaching a point where investors are not buying US debt, which is leading to a liquidity crunch, which is a problem. So if it takes $850 to run everything on that system, you need to tax at least $850 to start reducing the debt.
Yes.
That's my problem. So
Okay.
either you're going to let everybody keep the money, which is good. Generally, I'm in favor of that. You know, people don't have to spend as much. But the problem is we have a serious problem right now
With debt.
with the debt that is not being addressed, and I don't want to really spend more on things. So if there's a government system, you're going to have to pay the wages, pay for the infrastructure to set it up, you know, pay the ongoing costs. I don't want to lay that out until I know that we're going to start reducing that deficit.
You're correct there. You're really correct there. And I mean, there are plans to reduce spending by reducing spending in some parts, like military budgets, basically. However, this isn't really the topic at hand here. We're talking about fast food workers and tipping, but just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, I
So-
do think it's the underlying issue is that we don't provide, universal health care, but Mike brings up a good point that is there a plausible way to do that at this time? So it is kind of on topic,
Yes.
but we can kind of move back to the employees in general. And are there, is there anything more the employers can do? And if you want to talk to that, or Divya and Neev could continue to talk to that as well.
So one point I just wanted to make about tipping is that hopefully, ideally, the servers or the delivery person for Uber Eats would get 100% of the tips that are tipped by the customer, right? But we don't know if that's the case for every single restaurant where we do provide tips for, right? It's not a necessity that 100% of the tips go directly into the pockets of the people who those tips are supposed to be for.
I'd like to jump in there. There's also employers, again, can basically skim off tips, and that happens a lot more often than not. Also, employers also have a big impetus on how much tips that employees get. Like tips, a hardworking employee who let's say it's a waiter or waitress, like smiles all the time, always make sure that the table has filled drinks and all of that, and might be like the best waiter in the world. But if he or she works for a crappy restaurant, basically because the restaurant owner is kind of bad, like their tips are adversely affected. And like, even though they work hard, they might not even scrape by minimum wage.
So I would be more inclined to pass a regulation saying employers can no longer skim tips.
There are regulations in place for that. They're not really enforced hard, but yes.
Then in that case, I would be in favor of increasing the penalties and enforcing them much more. B, there are some restaurants which will do tip pools, essentially, ending that system. And instead, if you're waiting a table and you get a tip, that's your tip. It doesn't go into the pool. I think those two combined with, as I said earlier, the high velocity between these positions could help improve that system because A, you will be much more inclined to be a better server, knowing that, the tip pool, there's no tip pool anymore. So if you are a bad server and are getting bad tips, it's going to only screw yourself. And B, in the case of restaurants who are acting poorly, that high velocity allows you to look for jobs in restaurants that might do a better job of this.
I do know another problem with the tips. So also a lot of your tips, I know at diners, busboys get part of your tip for your table. So that's just like a cutback. That's pretty much paying your busboys to do the work for you. Because they make sure your tables are clean. And I know servers that are friends of mine that pretty much I'm guessing it's more universal than talked about. But there's discrimination when it comes to a waiter deciding to wait someone based on what tip they're going to get. Because sometimes, like if there's a usual, they know it doesn't tip well, they're probably not going to wait them because they know that they're not going to get the tip. So you're going to have like this underlying discrimination in your restaurant, and I don't think that's something that's really easy to get taken away from. It's like you have people who are already just gonna go, like when you walk into a restaurant and you don't look like you're well dressed, you look like you're a college student that might not tip. I don't think you're gonna get the service that you normally would get.
Are you
Uh,
telling me that discrimination doesn't happen now, though?
No,
Because
but I think tipping helps with that. I think tipping helps provide discrimination because it's like, would you work harder knowing you're probably going to get paid less for what you're doing, or would you rather not wait the table, wait for another customer to come, and then wait that table? Because
I mean, on the flip side of that, like if there was no tipping, there is no incentive to work hard at all. Like you see this in a whole bunch of industries with commissions.
yeah,
Like
because you're
salespeople.
getting minimum wage either way.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally agree.
see, but there's an expectation to like work hard. I feel like that can be instilled if you don't have tipping.
Exactly,
Tipping,
because that
That
can come from the manager of the establishment, like that drive to work hard.
yeah, you can also have a chain of command. Like, oh, if you work hard, you'll go up the chain of command. That's an incentive in itself. There's also, if you eliminate tipping, it doesn't necessarily mean that tipping doesn't exist. When I worked at McDonald's, I got tips at the window. I got tips doing my job every day. Those tips weren't on my paycheck. They weren't whatchamacallit. They weren't like asked from the customer. There wasn't an assumption that I was getting them.
there will be a serious decline in tips, though. If
Right.
I believe, like to take a cultural example, I know in Japan, tipping is taboo because it's seen as you rating the performance of the people who served you. So people don't, servers don't like to get tips in that sense because of the work. But if you're trying to build a system that incentivizes the work, you need the tip there as that gauge. Because otherwise there's going to be some acceptable minimum standard, say to keep your job, that people are going to eventually default into working that minimum standard because there's no incentive for them to work up because the tips have gone drastically down.
I do think you can still make incentives. I think you can still add incentives without tips. Tons of places do it. When you work at retail, you have sales incentives that can provide you cash for what you do. You have feedback
Isn't that
incentives.
commission?
Is that commission? Because you don't get paid
Pretty
on an
sure.
individual sale. You get paid for winning a pool, which is to compete against your fellow employees. Does it always come to fruition with most retail? Probably not, at least in my experience. If you won the things that didn't come to fruition, which causes another problem in itself. Well, tipping, you don't have that middle man, so you don't really have problem with fruition of the pool. But I do think there's plenty of incentives that exist without tipping.
Okay, I kind of want to wrap things up here. Divya, could you just comment a little bit on this debate as well?
Yeah, sure. So when Mike brought up like the cultural standpoint, I know it was also the case in Europe itself. I know like some owners will say like we pay our employees enough, so they don't actually like need to take in any tips itself. But I feel like that with America, a lot of the employees may not get paid as much without the tips. So I think the tips do incentivize them to work more and like actually increase their own wage, so they'll be able to like live their life a little better.
Going off that point, in a world where, in a society where all of our basic needs are taken care of, I would feel better about tipping than in a society about the institution of tipping, not tipping in general, but because in our world now, basically tipping kind of keeps people's needs met instead of as an extra incentive on top of what they're actually paid. So basically, to get paid a living wage, they need to be tipped, which kind of seems a little unethical. So if tipping is just for extra performance, like if you're really good and you deserve a little extra on top, yeah, that's good. But if you need to be tipped to be able to keep your house or to feed your kids, that shouldn't have to exist. That's at least my point of view.
Okay. So we're gonna wrap it up on this topic and move along to the next one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before our next segment, we'd like to do an ad read. Today's podcast is sponsored by Raid Shadow Legends, one of the biggest mobile role-playing games of 2020, and it's totally free. Currently, almost 10 million users have joined Raid over the last 6 months, and it's one of the most impressive games in its class, with detailed models, environments, and smooth 60 frames per second animations. All the champions in the game can be customized with unique gear that changes your strategic buffs and abilities. The dungeon bosses have some ridiculous skills of their own, and figuring out the perfect party and strategy to overtake them is a lot of fun. Currently, with over 300,000 reviews, Raid has almost a perfect score in the Play Store. The community is growing fast, and the highly anticipated new Faction Wars feature is now live. You might even find my squad out there in the arena. It's easier to start now more than ever with rates programs for new players to get a daily new login reward for the first 90 days that you play the game. So what are you waiting for? Go to the video description, click on the special links, and you'll get 50,000 silver and a free epic champion as part of this new player program to start your journey. Good luck, and I'll see you there.
Also,
All right, our next question revolves around the popular TV show, The Office. In season 5 of The Office, Michael Scott leaves Dunder Mifflin to start his own paper company after his fallout with management, convincing 2 employees to come with him. After undercutting Dunder Mifflin's prices, the Michael Scott Paper Company begins to steal clients. Michael is offered a buyout by Dunder Mifflin's CFO, but before the deal goes through, Dwight, a Dunder Mifflin employee, finds out that the Michael Scott Paper Company is bankrupt. Jim, a current employee at Dunder Mifflin, who is married to Pam, a current employee at the Michael Scott Paper Company, hides the fact he knows that the Michael Scott Paper Company is going bankrupt and dismisses Dwight's claims, leading to the buyout to happen in the form of 3 jobs. Was it ethical for Jim to hide that he knew of the bankruptcy and get his wife and friends their jobs back?
So basically, it wasn't Jim's responsibility to alert the company of the doings of the Michael Scott Paper Company. His job is basically as a salesman, and it just so happens that he's married to a person who works for their competitor. So if Dunder Mifflin expects for Jim to tell them like confidential information, like he doesn't have the responsibility to do so, and he really didn't have any job to work for the bailout anyway, like for doing any information gathering. Like all he was a salesman. He's not getting paid extra to be like, a researcher into whether there should be a company buyout. So there's no ethical reason for him to tell Dunder Mifflin that, hey, the company that you're trying to buy out is about to go into bankruptcy.
I agree with Simon on this. Surprisingly enough, there's a requirement on the part of Dunder Mifflin to do adequate research on firms that they're seeking to buy. To go in, what's the asset value of this company? What are we getting with them? Essentially, Dunder Mifflin panic bought because they saw that all of their clients were being swiped away. They panic bought out their competitors. So when you do that, there's going to be an information premium that you're going to pay. And Dunder Mifflin, in their panic, did not do their research into the Michael Scott Paper Company well enough to see that, oh, this company has about 6 weeks left of solvency. If we just wait them out, we can get our business back. Instead, they rushed into a deal, and that's the price of rushing into that deal. It's not Jim's job to tell them, oh, hey, this company might be going bankrupt.
I do think, though, it is Jim's job not to tell them that they're not. Like, Jim should have not dismissed Dwight's claim. I don't think that was necessarily ethical in itself, because that's essentially,
But Dwight also has the ability to send this up the chain.
No, he does as well. I don't think I think Jim has a responsibility not to do anything, not to have a conflict of interest in this scenario. I think what he should do is remove himself from the entire conversation. And I think him dismissing the claim to Dwight, I don't think is ethical. But I do think that Jim, I don't know how Jim dismisses it, because to my
Jim
understanding,
isn't really involved in the
So
decision.
Jim dismisses it by bringing up that Dwight is basically crazy. Like, Dwight came in saying, hey, I've got information about the Michael Scott Paper Company, and you should really hear me out. And then Jim comes by and says, oh, like you have information about the rat problem in the building, or something to that effect.
all right.
And yeah, that didn't really pan out. So Jim doesn't outright deny saying, hey, Dwight is wrong here. What he does is bring up other things that Dwight has done to try and show that Dwight is kind of untrustworthy when it comes to investigating things.
I just. Oh,
Go
you
ahead.
That
go,
sounds
Steve.
like
No,
more
that's
of a
my fault.
distraction than an outright.
Yeah. You can
So-
go, Neev.
So if I'm not wrong, I believe the CFO of Dunder Mifflin was consulting with Jim. At that time, he was in the room. He was the person that informed Michael Scott about the offer originally, if I'm not wrong, correct me if I am. But when you are being trusted by the CFO of your company, then when you're given access to that information, you are technically a part of this purchase plan. You're part of this acquisition, so you do have the duty to inform your company of significant material facts regarding that acquisition, right? Because one way the company is doing research is by sending Jim in. It might not have been direct, but that is one way. So they did have the resources in place to do their research. But then Jim decided to stick with a personal conflict of interest rather than with his company.
So just to,
Well,
before you guys continue, just to bring this up as well, Jim was the one who was sent down to make the initial proposal of a buyout. And that was on company time as a company representative when he was informed that the company, that the Michael Scott Paper Company was going bankrupt. So I just wanted to clear that just to make sure there was no confusion. And Divya, you were speaking, so.
Yeah, I feel like
Continue.
he shouldn't have been the one. I feel if I'm understanding the situation correctly, he shouldn't have been the one to actually create the proposal by Dunder Mifflin because he has the conflict of interest with the Michael Scott company because his wife works for there. So I feel like the company itself made a mistake of doing that.
Another,
That falls on Dunder Mifflin because it's not like Jim. I know this is The Office, so it's not like Jim and Pam's relationship is a secret in season 5.
like they're literally married.
They're married, and everybody was at the
Well,
wedding.
they're not married, but
They're not married at that point.
They're
but,
not
like,
married yet. They're
they were
dating,
engaged.
but it's public. They're
Also-
engaged. That's
Also,
it.
the reason Jim was sent in was because Michael Scott Michael Scott likes Jim. Like, he has a friendly relationship with most of the Michael Scott Paper Company, which is why they thought that him giving the proposal, it would sound better coming from them.
So
But the point is, as Chris mentioned, sorry, just 1 second.
sure.
He was a company representative at that time during working hours. He obtained material information. He was a part of the acquisition in his own way. So I do believe that it was his duty to inform the CFO and bring that up rather than dismissing Dwight's claim.
So Jim gained the information that the company was going bankrupt from his wife, not from Michael Scott. So
His
they
wife
had a
was still
private
a part of the
conversation.
I
company.
believe that's
However,
incorrect.
And that was no, when he went down to tell Michael Scott of the buyout plan, he went down and said, I am here to just give you information and learn as little as possible. And when he said we're thinking Dunder Mifflin is thinking of buying you out, and Michael said, but Jim, we're going, and then Jim stopped him. Jim stopped him from saying that they're going bankrupt, and essentially did not learn any information from Michael Scott about the company's plan. What he learned was from Pam, but prior to being, told that he is to be the intermediary between the two companies. So
Jim
he
does
learned
have
this-
plausible deniability there. Michael could have been about to say, "We're going to get a water slide."
Yeah.
And Jim knew that, like, if he heard Michael say, we're going bankrupt, like, he can't do anything about it. That's why he stopped him.
I do think. Oh, my bad. You can
Go
finish,
ahead, Peter.
I'm sorry.
I'm basically done.
I do think that it does come down entirely to, like, the way it's told. Like, with his wife, he has no. I feel like that's just, like, personal information that doesn't have to be exposed.
Yeah.
And like, I think we might want to explore it if we take the two different pathways. That seems like, because if he was told, well, I guess he did do exactly that. If he was told from Michael Scott, that would be plausible deniability. But I do think even the fact that he has a conflict of interest, I still think it's the company's fault. So I think if he doesn't tell the company should assume that he has a conflict of interest, and then that is one of the risk factors that they are willing to accept going into it.
Here's how I see the problems. Jim is knowingly engaged to 1/3 of the Michael Scott Paper Company, and Dunder Mifflin still sends him in. Dwight has, David Wallace's phone number. Dwight has called David Wallace on multiple times. Charles is literally at the desk, like 10 feet away from Dwight. Dwight did not tell either of those people that the Michael Scott Paper Company was going out of business. And Dwight's aware of this information. Dwight instead took that information and sent it horizontally across the command structure, because Jim is also just a salesman, and Jim's not empowered to change the deal. Jim's just the intermediary.
What happened was that Dwight went to his superior with the information. Jim rushed in with him to try and distract from it, and it worked.
He tried to send it up the command structure, but essentially Jim forced it to be sent horizontally across the structure.
Yeah.
Then that fault still lies on David
company
and Charles, because they chose not to take Dwight's claim seriously.
Now,
And they chose not to investigate the Michael Scott Paper Company on their own anyway.
Yeah.
Like
if they took the approach of talking to any of the clients and noticed that, hey, they're asking for more money from their clients, like, they would know that they are not in good shape financially, and it is basically on them for not doing the research. However, Jim in real life, if this happens, and Jim should have basically recused himself right away. Like if we're talking about business ethics, like not he technically worked in favor for the Michael Scott Paper Company, but he should have recused himself.
In that sense, the fault, I think, goes on both of them. Both on Jim for not recusing himself.
Yeah.
Agree. Also on Dunder Mifflin, because they should know that this conflict of interest exists before they even pick Jim.
Yes.
As we've been saying, this is a very public relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And we can mention too that the reason that Dunder Mifflin panic bought the Michael Scott Paper Company is because there was a shareholder meeting coming up soon. So because of that, management didn't want to make it seem like they lost a lot of clients.
Yeah. I think the argument that Michael Scott went to try and up the price of the company was that, hey, we don't need to wait out Dunder Mifflin for them to go bankrupt and for us to win. No.
Dunder Mifflin needs to wait out us.
No.
Because we're going to hold their clients, essentially.
No. Basically, Michael had the argument like, I need to wait out you, David Wallace, because if you don't buy me out now, the shareholders will vote you out of your position and will fire you. So David Wallace kind of put his personal job ahead of the company there. And that is also a failure of business ethics.
That's a good point.
Yeah, because David Wallace was afraid of the job repercussions coming to him instead of, forcing the company into a possibly bad deal.
Yes, but in David Wallace's view as CFO of the company, isn't him keeping his position in the best interests of the company?
Not if the shareholders don't think so.
But the shareholders haven't decided that yet. It's not like the shareholders said, David, you're fired, and he barricaded himself in his office and refused to leave.
So the thing
It's
is,
David Wallace is trying to preserve his job before the shareholders find out that anything is wrong. All companies do that.
They do, but I don't. Is it ethical?
Generally, the interests of management and the interests of the shareholders are aligned.
Generally.
For different goals. The shareholders are there to make money. The management's there to preserve their jobs. Both want the business to succeed.
Fair.
Do we have anything else on this topic?
No? Well, I think we came to a good conclusion that everyone wasn't ethical, basically.
The fault is on everyone.
The fault is on everyone, and this is a television show.
Okay. So in that case, we're going to move right along to our final topic. All right. For our last question, we want to talk a little bit about the environment. Who is to blame for environmental damages to communities over the last few decades?
So I don't think the blame lies with any one source. It's on consumers' fault for their, tastes and preferences, which lead to products being made, say, for example, the American palate for beef, leads to a lot of methane production from cows. It's also on companies who might be taking less environmentally friendly approaches to, say, waste management in how they produce their products, but I don't think the blame lies squarely on any one facet. Kind of everybody's fault to some extent.
I think Mike's kind of correct here, but let me put on a nice background here.
Simon agreed with me.
Let me put on a nice background here. Okay, so I feel like, yeah, there's some blame to the American consumer, but the lion's share of the blame should be going on corporations because they have definitely taken most of the time, basically all of the time, the most profitable approach to things. And the most profitable approach to things nearly almost always never lines up with the most environmentally friendly. And the way that we control for the environment is basically by regulating these companies. And if companies are involved in the regulatory process, like currently on most of the regulatory boards in the government, this administration has placed company insiders as the head of the boards. And if they're a part of the process in regulating themselves, they almost never come up with the most environmentally friendly regulation. So even though consumers want things, like demand for like meat will never go away. However, more sustainable farming practices are there and can be practiced, but they just choose not to because the other ways are more profitable. And there's basically no law forcing them to.
Yeah, I also feel the same way. Like you can give some blame to desires, but I feel like ultimately it's the actions itself that contribute to like environmental problems. So if you look at what a consumer can do, is like they may produce like some plastic waste, but like the amount that one person contributes isn't that much compared to like all the environmental and waste production that actually company might do with like how they manufacture goods and all the greenhouse gas emissions. So primarily, like, most of the blame should go to the companies with how their practices are.
So,
I
oh, sorry, Peter, you go.
I think it's the problem with like more regulatory lacking. I don't think you can blame a company for trying to be profitable because every company wants to be as profitable as it can be.
Yeah.
So like yeah, I don't think it's a fault of the company to be desiring that profits. If they cut corners through means of like not helping the environment, there's not really a repercussion because it's what their competitors are doing as well. But there is a repercussion if they help the environment. It's not like we advertise, oh, so and so saves, destroying the ozone layer or whatever greenhouse gas, climate change stuff. We don't really see that, and that's not really advertised well. And if it is advertised, it seems more like a publicity stunt than an actual, oh, I saved the environment. And I think that is where the fault lies, is we need to just bring up everything to ground levels to allow the companies to have to do this, because you're always going to have to go the more profitable route if you want to stay in company, or stay in business rather, I guess.
So there's a lot to unpack between what's been said. To start with the regulatory boards, as you said about this administration, yes, this is also not a 4-year long problem. This problem has been going on for decades through administrations on both sides of the aisle.
You're correct. You're very correct in that.
And no one's really taken meaningful steps on either side that have helped on things.
Excuse me. You guys see this, right? Yeah.
See
okay.
what? I see your parents' wedding photo. Is that it?
No.
No,
I
Simon, I see
I
your
promised
point.
myself I would bring it up at least once. Anyway,
I see seniors. Is that senior?
so
Yeah, senior 2017.
and I'm not gonna unpack that whole box of snakes. I didn't want to use the phrase can of worms, so I went with box of snakes.
That's fair.
Original.
However, what's the expression? You act on the throne, but the throne acts on you. For as much as things change, things also very much stay the same. So just because, Bernie Sanders might wish something to happen and might try to will it to happen, there are still loads of bureaucracy that needs to go through that slim the chances of things happening. And to quote Forrest Gump, that's all I'm going to say about that. Moving on to, as you said, like the sustainable farming practices, we do have that. There are farms that do that, and there are consumers who will pay premium for that. It comes down to an information gap, and B, a cost effectiveness gap. So if I'm at the store, and I've made this decision a lot of times, if I'm at the store and I want to buy some beef for dinner because I'm craving meat, and I look at ShopRite brand steaks that are, say, $7 a pound, or I look at the organic, responsibly sourced meat, which is $12 a pound, I'm going to go for the more cost-effective option. A, because I get to eat more meat. You know, that's always good. And B, because I don't place as much of an emphasis on that responsibility as I do on being able to use my money for, say, I can buy maybe 2 nights worth of dinner for the same price as 1 night's. And that's a decision that needs to be made for people.
So my response to that is basically, yeah, you're correct in there is bureaucracy preventing, government action, but that doesn't mean that whoever sits on the throne shouldn't be pushing for it, or we should elect someone who doesn't push for it at all. We should always
Definitely.
have that ideal in that of yes.
I'm just
You're
saying
correct in
that to say, say, for example, I know this wasn't the argument, so I'm going to
Sure.
to reduce it a bit to make my point, but to say, if we elect Bernie Sanders, then the environment gets fixed. To do
Yeah.
that 2-step solution is not how that's going to work. There's going to be 20,000 steps in the middle of it that it can get hung up on.
Yeah, you're definitely correct.
The ideal is fine. I totally get that. But to go
Yes.
elect this guy, he's going to fix it all, is not a valid argument either.
You're definitely correct in that. And going off the second argument, where the cost effectiveness argument, when it adversely affects our health, I think we should start putting in regulations. Like in I think it's the early 1900s, Upton Sinclair's The Jungle showed that the meat industry was basically giving us completely unsanitary products. And I think the same argument can be placed to now to unenvironmentally friendly products where they are hurting our health by being placed onto the market. And I
Yes.
think
Sorry, finish your point. Sorry.
Sure. And I think government regulation should put a stop to that.
So going back to your example with Upton Sinclair, you're exactly right. That's why the government ended up passing the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. That is the entire background leading up to that.
Yes.
Alongside other drives, like for example, Henry Heinz's son, who had studied chemistry, was a big proponent of the Pure Food and Drug Act and had helped lobby for it. That's just a fact to throw in with that. The problem is, for the vast majority of people, it is hard for them to fathom, if you don't fix X, say 30 years down the line, Y is going to happen that will negatively impact you. People do not have good long-term vision.
That's true.
Whereas the Pure Food and Drug Act, if you buy a can of shoddy tomatoes, you will find
get
shoddy tomatoes.
Yes.
That's a lot easier for people to fathom and gain support for it's a lot harder to gain that impact, especially with the numbers that actually matter. Engaging, say, climate change, like the globe has warmed about 1 or 2 degrees in the last, I want to say, the last 100 or so years. That's really hard for people to fathom as being an impact because you think, okay, so I went from 69 degrees to 70 degrees. Those feel exactly the same.
You're correct
That's
in
part
that.
of the problem in trying to affect that change.
You're very correct in that view that people don't really have good long-term thinking. But what affects people's long-term thinking a lot is what they hear through, say, through their political leaders, through advertising. And companies affect these political leaders by lobbying, by campaign donations, and they affect advertising by paying for it. So they're effectively influencing people to thinking that global warming doesn't really matter that much, even though scientists who theoretically aren't biased at all are saying that global warming is a big issue.
You touched on the key word though.
Theoretically. Yes.
That leads into part of the problem because obviously these studies need funding.
Yes.
So we only ever really talk about when the funding comes from, say a
Monsanto.
large oil company
Yeah.
like ExxonMobil or a manufacturer like Monsanto. We never talk about when it comes from, say, the Sienna Group or the American Environmental Institute. I kind of just made that name up. I don't know if it's an actual thing.
Probably
Sounded
is.
real enough. We don't look at those, we don't scrutinize those sources of funding nearly as much as we look at the other side. So, that also plays into it. And if all of the voices were being silenced, you wouldn't have people like Greta Thunberg or like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who are pushing for radical change, and not radical being used in, to refer to a political stance, radical being used in reference to differing from now, pushing for radical changes.
And you're very correct in that scientists are a lot of time biased by their funding. However, there are funding sources that are unbiased, like the U.S. government. However, there are people who seem to like to cut funding for environmental research by the U.S. By U.S. government funded scientific teams.
But here's something that I think you missed because you made this almost this exact opposite point earlier.
Sure.
In saying that this administration has been going anti, environmental regulation.
Yeah, and
Do you not think they will be funding studies
that
would be in support of their claims, and that when an opposing administration comes in, they will not be funding studies that seek to be pro their stance? So to say that the government is unbiased
and then
is
say
also
that they're
not
biased.
really.
Yes, that's a issue with my argument. However, in a scientific science, what am I saying? Researchers from, let's say, colleges or researchers should not have their conclusion before their actual research, which should preclude them from any bias other than the facts. However, there are researchers who come up with a conclusion before they even make the research.
Yeah. After all, we're all just dumb monkeys playing with very high-tech tools.
Yes. However, but the general scientific consensus, and this is like without bias because of the sheer number of, researchers taken, is that there is a genuine issue with the environment and that something needs to be done.
This is going to be a bad argument, but I understand that before I make the argument.
Sure.
I want to use it to lead into something else.
Sure.
So there was a vast general consensus in the 1940s that smoking did not adversely affect you. As the research was done, then we
Right.
found that it led to, lung cancer and strokes and things of that nature.
Yes.
So to say that there is a consensus, therefore we're set, right away to go do something, not always a solid argument, because we had a consensus on smoking. We had a consensus on leaded gasoline for a while, and then we realized, oh, leaded gasoline is terrible for the environment. So we took the lead out of gasoline. What I think that we should do is, and I break these down into two different camps. There's environmentalism and there's conservationism. So environmentalism is, in my view, let's throw everything we can at the problem to just rush to try to solve the problem. The intent there, I understand, I don't necessarily agree with. I don't necessarily disagree with. It's the execution I have a problem with. Conservation is, let's try to preserve what we have, preserve the natural resources we have, work through consumer change, and then aim to step in as those efforts, can't meet the needs that we have. So I am much more define myself as a conservationist than as an environmentalist. So for example, the national park system and the national monument system, fantastic job. Absolutely agree with and disagree with this administration's, delabeling of certain sites as national monuments to allow, or as of protected areas to allow businesses to come in for the natural resources. Disagree on that decision. I think they should have been kept. And this comes out of my scouting career because I spent a lot of time as my troops leave no trace coordinator. This was my shtick. Totally agree with the conservation aspect on that end. On the environmental end of, we need to rush and say replace all coal-fired power plants. All coal and gas-fired power plants with wind and solar. That's where you lose me, especially because nuclear energy does not enter the equation in the sense of we have sustainable thorium reactors, which are better than regular uranium or plutonium fired reactors in almost all aspects. That I think that should be the intermediate step we go to while wind and solar try to become more cost effective. So if the environmental movement, say, was more open to nuclear power, I would be more willing to throw myself onto that end of it, because that's a step that we can reasonably take at this point. Companies won't go bankrupt from opening nuclear power plants, but there is a large risk. Look at Solar City. Solar City went bankrupt, and that was the premier solar energy company. So that's my difficulty.
Okay. Your point of view is very thought out, and I really like it. However, I believe that there are actors who say that they're conservationists, but in reality, they're just profit motivated. Like, it benefits them the most by staying where we are and stealthily pushing legislation back. That
Are you saying there's nobody like that on the environmental end?
I'm-
Companies who will say, look at us, we're going green, but really not, because they're doing it for the PR stunts?
there are people on that side, but at least it benefits the environment a little.
Peter, Divya, or Neev, do you guys want to jump in real quick?
So I think if we just bring it back to the original question, who is to blame for the environmental damages to communities over the last few decades? I think there are different situations, like Mike and Simon and everyone have been saying, that there are ways to spread blame. Like, for example, companies that produce environmentally unfriendly goods, right? This could be cigarettes, this could be the methods of production that they use to produce certain goods like plastics. I think they're mainly enabled by consumers. So the public needs to understand that they are enabling what they do, what these companies do by buying these products, right? It might be more expensive to buy more sustainable products, buying organic food, things like that. But these are choices that we make that have consequences, right? So you can buy a more expensive organic product and the consequence of that is more financial to you. Whereas you could go for the cheaper option and then the consequences will be felt either by you decades from now or by generations that come after us. So I think weighing those consequences is obviously a very difficult thing, but there are times when companies themselves are to blame too. For example, when companies, for example, a lot of oil spills that have happened in the past, a lot of them can be traced back to negligence in terms of safety constrictions from, or safety conditions, sorry, that companies have with their production. That is something that the company is 100% to blame for, or if not the company's management, then the shareholders that enable the attitude of cutting costs in every single aspect that's possible, right? So whenever companies are not being transparent with the public about their practices and then things backfire, that is on the companies and then to a certain extent the shareholders. But when there is a lot of transparency as to how companies produce, for example, sweatshops in China that Apple uses to make iPhones, right? That's public knowledge. While everyone might not be aware of it, that knowledge is publicly available, and a lot of people do know that, have that knowledge, and decide to buy iPhones anyway for a multitude of reasons. It doesn't make them bad, but it does mean that there is some sense of complicity there's some sense of being complicit with what Apple is doing. That's all I'd like to say.
I do think, you talked a lot about negligence, and I think there's negligence around the entire chain. I think when you make a purchase, when you make an iPhone, I personally know the first thing I think of when I buy a phone is not what is the environmental impact, and that's a negligence that I'm willing to accept. I think that goes for a lot of people, is we don't have a way to show the environmental impact on like the packaging, for example. And that's part of the whole marketing side of it, is you're want to distract the person from seeing their bad parts, which would be that an iPhone's made in a sweatshop. And I think it's negligence across the entire chain. I think when a company or an individual does something that might be risky for the environment, like in Flint, Michigan, I'm sure the government didn't decide. They're like, you know what, this is gonna really poison a bunch of people in a couple of years. They're like, nah, it might not be great, but we'll save money now to help the future because the money now is better. I think it comes down to negligence on that. I don't think people maliciously are like, it's going to be worse if we do this. I think everyone has an idea that it's going to be better if they're, even somewhat environmental, which I like to think our government hypothetically would be. But it's just coming down to negligence all across the chain. And I don't think you can really blame one individual or blame anything else. I think it's just you have to be proactive with the laws. You have to always be reforming them to push a little bit of a boundary. Because I think if you're conservative, you're complacent, like you said. If you're conservativist, sorry. I think you're a little complacent. But I do think Mike brought up the good point of you still have to push forward. So I think rather than having a full environmentalist approach where it's like, let's just do all this now, is you're going to have to take intermediate steps that might seem small at first, but as long as they're always progressing, we in theory will always have a cleaner environment than we did before. The concept of American dream, which you have now, have better for the future.
The problem is that we are past the time that we can take small steps. And
I think small stacks are all relative.
Yeah.
And studies have been saying that we've been approaching or past the time for years. There were claims in the 80s that we were past the time. And
mean-
then studies came out that refuted those. And then there were claims in the 90s, and then those were refuted. So we've always been in that. I'm skeptical of that statement that we are past the time where we can enact moderate changes instead of radical ones. I'm always going to be skeptical of that statement, especially when we haven't reached the point that taking that radical change is going to be cost effective. So nuclear we know is cost effective.
Yeah.
Wind and solar have yet to reach that cost effective point because we're still trying to develop the technology to be cheaper. So like even putting solar panels on your house, for example, is still a few $1,000s. You know. So to to just try to make that change of, flip the switch in a sense, we need a bit of a transition period while we move to that stance. I'm not saying nuclear is the permanent solution. I definitely
Yeah.
wind, solar, geothermal should be the permanent solutions because of the renewability. But until they're cost effective, there's going to be no impetus to jump in on it. And if we argue that the impetus will come from, say, government action, then we jump back to the problem we had earlier of, are we going to be able to afford it? Because right now we have 25 trillion in debt and lower demand for that debt. So that's why I'm arguing for more cost-effective solutions as we move, because that provides impetus for people to do it.
I think that the issue here is that, yes, it's not going to be cost effective, but I think we have a duty to pay that cost and to shoulder that cost because we made the wrong decisions. Not specifically us, but prior generations made the wrong decisions that we need to rectify now so that next generations don't have to shoulder those issues.
And a lot of those issues can be solved with a nuclear solution, at least in the intermediate term. A large proportion of America's, production of greenhouse gases comes from the energy sector.
Yes, and nuclear. I am not totally against nuclear energy. Like there are definitely statistics are definitely favor the side of nuclear energy. However, it's funny how you brought up the nuclear option as is the conservative option, but I think that you're correct that we should be definitely using nuclear energy since it is cleaner. We should be using cleaner things, and nuclear is cleaner. Therefore, we should be using nuclear more and more.
To pose this question to you, would you rather learn that all of the solar panels that we needed, say to switch, were made by ramping up coal and gas-fired plants so that they could provide the energy for the rushed output, or would you rather them be produced by uranium and thorium-based reactors?
Yeah, I'd rather them being made by uranium and thorium reactors, but we need to do an analysis on whether, we need to ramp up production for the uranium and thorium, and then we need to ramp up production using that and decide which one causes more pollution.
Yes.
So,
I understand that point.
Yeah.
That's where I say we come back to the cost effective issue again. Because as I've been saying,
And I think
the
you're
predominant methods are not yet cost effective. When we reach that point, let's dive in. But until that point, it's going to stay, for lack of a better term, a niche power solution.
so I think what we're not waiting on basically solar panels to become cheaper to produce. We're waiting on coal and oil to become more scarce and to become more expensive. And when we reach that point, it will be harder to wean ourselves off of coal and oil when there's less of it and there is more basically demand for it, essentially. So we need to be transitioning now before we get to that point where we run out of coal and oil.
And that's why I've been advocating for that intermediate. Because granted, I do not have the numbers in front of me.
Me neither.
I would argue that thorium reactors, which are a proven technology, are likely more cost effective for a business to build than a solar plant at this point.
Yes.
So that's why I've been arguing, because if we use that price point example, say we need oil to reach $100 a barrel for
Yes.
solar and wind to truly be that cost effective point. So say like solar and wind here, oil here at 100. Well, maybe thorium only needs it to be at 85 for that transition to happen. This gap is always going to exist between the two. At least until we have systems in place for mass production of solar panels and wind turbines, which we don't have those infrastructures yet, and we don't have companies that are anywhere near that scale. The largest was Solar City, and they've gone by the wayside.
There's a solution here that the government could do, and it involves a carbon tax to make coal and oil more expensive, and that would force companies to kind of use nuclear energy and solar and wind energy.
Yes, you would need to be extremely careful in how you structure it, though, because a lot of individual homes are still heated by oil and
Coal.
natural gas.
Yes.
So
There-
you would need to be very careful in how you were to go about that legislation.
Yeah, and it's politicians' jobs. No politician of right mind would penalize houses more than businesses unless there is an ulterior motive, which there is a lot of times.
Yes,
So
politicians do not have exactly the best track record of
I know.
structuring things correctly.
yes. Peter, you're laughing a lot. I wonder if
No, I'm agreeing. I just think it's very accurate.
like I wouldn't put it like if you were pro coal, you might sabotage the bill by making it like, yeah, houses get taxed more than businesses so that it gets shot down right away.
I'm sure that's absolutely what happens.
That's what would happen.
Which
Yeah.
you do run into that difficulty with some states whose
Yeah.
economies rely very heavily on.
And companies too, like they might start, oh, we can't pay for this tax. We got to start, cutting employees. Well, you
Well, that
like
will
a stock-
happen.
you did a stock buyback for $20 billion last quarter. Let's stop those rather than, cutting employees.
Yes, but on the flip side, say ExxonMobil as an example,
Yes.
ExxonMobil's profit margin is only about 9 cents per dollar spent.
Yes.
So
Putting on a
yes,
9 cent.
while companies should, you know, if you have to choose between a stock buyback and paying the tax, then yes, obviously don't do the buyback. But on the other hand, it's not like these companies are making, 50% margins. They're making fairly slim margins already. So for some of them, it will be extremely difficult to pay for this without cutting jobs.
Yes. And that's definitely an issue where people's livelihoods are kind of attached to destroying the environment. And it's gonna that's a big issue
Yes,
that
but
we
for a lot of those people, their job isn't, nobody becomes a petroleum engineer
yeah
so
no
they can
one
go,
no one
haha,
wants
let me
to
twiddle my mustache and kill some pandas. They do it
I
because
know, but it
it's a
just
high
so
demand job that pays a lot of money.
yes, and
Also kills pandas.
that's definitely an issue. Like no one wants to destroy the environment. It just so happens that they chose a career path that did that. And it's not, I don't think it's really their fault. It's more the company's fault. Okay.
All right. So does anybody else have any other closing remarks they'd like to make?
I guess that's the result of like all that discussion. It's really hard to like definitively like decide what ethical aspects you want to introduce in like company actions itself. Like you have to do the cost benefit analysis, but it's hard to like you want to like take into consideration your company's profits. You want to take into consideration all the environmental aspects, but we don't really know what's the right answer for any of this.
So there's an economic theory in cost benefit analysis where they say that if you measured if you took costs and you measured the external costs that are paid by a third party that wasn't involved in the decision to like produce or buy, right? If you took in monetary values for those costs, then the cost would be higher. And then but if businesses had to pay those costs on top of the actual cost of producing and selling and just going about their operations, if they had to pay that additional cost, then things would become a lot less. It would be a lot less financially savvy to make those decisions in the first place, which would reduce their incentives. But again, monetizing that cost, putting a value on the actual cost that's faced, and then charging that to businesses in some form of tax, that would be a political and just logistical nightmare, I think.
But in that system, do you do that for the benefits as well? So say I
yes.
produce a product and then somebody uses that product to start a business.
Yes, I do.
There's a positive economic impact.
Mhm.
I just want to make sure that system takes into account both sets of externalities.
And I'm not advocating for this system. I just thought like when Divya mentioned cost benefit analysis, just put that thought into my head that there are academic economists with PhDs have come up with this system that probably would never work, but it's just something to consider in mind. Like even when we make our own decisions, we can think about the effect that these decisions will have on third parties. We don't have to monetize it, we don't have to quantify that cost, but just thinking about it gives us more context as to the consequences of our decisions and those of the people around us.
All right. If nobody else has any other comments, then that's going to be the end for us. And thank you to everyone who listened.
Mm-hmm.
Chris, you forgot to thank our sponsor.
And thank you to our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends, the best mobile game on the app market.
Also follow David Smoliak on YouTube.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all for watching.
Thank you.
Au revoir.